Welcome to our event. Is deforestation stoppable by 2030? Progress and pathways. My name is Huma Khan, and I am the head of communications for WWF International's Forest Practice. Before we get started, just a quick logistics note. We will have a panelist who will be joining us shortly, who will speak in Spanish. So if you require translation, to my left here are headsets available. Please walk over there. You will need to leave your badge, but you'll be able to get a headset, and when you return it, you'll get your badge back at the end. So I think we'll get started a little early since all our panelists are here. Thank you again for joining. Today we're really gathering here to go in depth on the key findings from two recent reports, the Forest Declaration Assessment as well as the Forest Pathways Report. The reports, which were released just recently in October, outlined the state of forests currently, but also the solutions and the pathways that are needed to halt deforestation by 2030. We'll focus on the role of the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership and the national action plans that were announced last weekend, as well as the important role of Indigenous people in implementing solutions. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. To the extreme right is Julian Gladstone, who is the lead consultant at Climate Focus and an author of the Forest Declaration Assessment. To the left of Julian is Mary Gagan, Chief Advisor on Forests at WWF UK and the lead author of WWF's Forest Pathways Report, which was released jointly with the assessment. And then we have Maggie. Maggie Charnley is the head of the UK government's International Forest Unit. She has oversight of the UK International Forest Strategy, including international climate finance and the instrument developed following the forest commitments made at the UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow. And then we have Roslyn Fossua-Adjage, the Director of Climate Change at Ghana's Forestry Commission, the National Red Plus Focal Point for Ghana, and co-chair of the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, the FCLP. And we have one more panelist who I will introduce when we have her joining shortly. So I would like to start with a question for Gillian. Gillian, a global assessment of progress on forest goals has taken place annually since the signing of the New York Declaration on Forests in 2014. Some years we have seen progress, but the results of this year's assessments are quite bleak. What are the top three key findings of the 2023 assessment and about also the progress towards the 2030 goals of halting forest loss?
Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Huma, for kicking us off. It's really a pleasure to be here talking with you all and with my other panelists. I am here representing the Forest Declaration Assessment. I will correct that I'm not the author, but one of many authors. So we organize, coordinate, and convene the Forest Declaration Assessment, an annual progress assessment of tracking progress against the 2030 forest goals. This is our 9th year publishing an annual assessment of progress, and we do this in partnership with 24 research and civil society organizations. So together, we take a broad view of how we're doing as a collective in meeting those goals. This year's report is pretty unequivocal that at this point, the world is not on track to meet those 2030 goals enshrined in the Glasgow Leaders Declaration to end deforestation and degradation within the decade. We saw that we are off track on a lot of these indicators. We saw 6.6 million hectares of deforestation in 2022, which is the most recent year for which we have data and measure progress. That represented a 4% increase in deforestation over the previous year, and worryingly, that actually represents 6% increase in gross emissions from deforestation since the previous year. So definitely moving in the wrong direction on those indicators. We know that when we lose primary forests and other landscapes, there are devastating knock-on effects to a range of impacts on people and livelihoods and communities. You know, one of these things that we look at in detail is biodiversity. We saw that we lost biodiversity at an alarming rate. Looking at indicator species, we saw a 79% decline in biodiversity since 1970. Through the most recent year from which we have data, 2018. So, you know, this, I think, confirms something that we suspect, but that the losses when we lose these primary forests is just, you know, hard to even get your head around. In addition to those headline numbers, we also look at things like governance and finance. And one of the sort of standout findings is that by and large, governments are still not putting the priority they need to on forests to meet those 2030 goals, and really aligning the economic and development plans with their environment and forest protection plans, not putting the money and the financing behind them they need to preserve forests to meet that goal. And just as an example, we see that public funding for initiatives and activities that have the potential to undermine forests, so gray finance, is still far outweighing the finance being put towards activities that can protect forest or green finance. And just so we don't end, or we don't only talk about sort of the bleak stuff, and I know we'll come back to some of the positive things happening on the ground, but you know, I think it's important to note that we have ideas about what we need to do to protect forests. We've seen in our research that Indigenous people and local communities are the most effective stewards of forest land, but again, we're not seeing sufficient funds being allocated to those communities in line with the estimated need for them to achieve land tenure and protect forests.
Thank you, Julian. Lots of findings in the assessment to digest, and we'll have time to go more into details. Before I move to Mary, I'd like to introduce our final panelist, Sarah Omi, who just joined us. She was coming from another event. Sarah Omi is an Imbera lawyer and Indigenous rights advocate in Panama. She founded an organization called Amari Imbera Organization, and also serves as the president of the Territorial Women's Leaders in the Mesoamerican Alliance of Peoples and Forests, and she represents women in the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. So I'll go to you next, Mary, since the Forest Pathways report, which was released simultaneously, complemented very well the state of the forests that were presented in the assessment. And in the Forest Pathways report, WWF specifically sought to define a common set of threats and recommendations for moving ground on global forest goals. We'll talk about the recommendations later, but can you talk about the top threats that were identified in the report, particularly the ones that we need to pay most urgent attention to right now?
Yeah, thanks, Huma, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and it's lovely to have a chance to talk trees and climate and nature with my fellow panelists here. Just before I move on to the question, you'll see these very jazzy-looking stripes on a lot of our slides, and as Gillian mentioned, they're part of the climate stripes family that you might be familiar with. The climate stripes tend to show global temperature change, but what you're looking at here is that change in the population abundance of forest-dwelling species that come from the Forest Specialist Index, and the change reducing by nearly 80% between the last time we had observations in the start of when we had observations in around 1970 to around 2018. Sorry, thanks. So yeah, just moving on to the findings around threats in the Forest Pathways report. So alongside the very quantitative forest declaration assessment, what we tried to do in Pathways was to have more of a narrative exploration of the way that we are making or not making progress towards those twin goals for 2030 of reducing, halting deforestation and restoring what's been lost. And in Pathways, we talked about those threats through really three lenses. First, I'll talk about the physical threats to forests, actually. I suspect my colleagues on this panel will talk a lot more about threats that arise from the denial of rights to Indigenous peoples and local communities, and in fact, realization of those rights when they do exist, access to markets, that sort of thing. The threats that arise from systemic issues with our financial and trade systems that continue to incentivize conversion of forests to agricultural land and actually are ensuring that the true cost of that conversion to people, to nature and to climate is actually just not paid. It's an invoice that nobody pays. But that first kind of silo of threats really come actually from climate change itself. And I think it's really important not to overlook that. The impacts of change, climate change, so hotter droughts in particular and wildfires on trees and forests are actually devastating. So even where I live in the mild temperate zone in Europe, in some parts of Europe, we've seen an 80% increase in the mortality of trees from heat stress and from drought over the last decade, over the last 10 years. And those physical threats really intertwine our forest and our climate goals. So without that course change to 1.5 compatible behaviors from across the sector, those physical threats to forests are just going to keep increasing. Actually, when climate modelers explore the difference for forests between pathways that are compatible with 1.5 and take the boldest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and compare those to pathways that are not ambitious and actually would look to be 2 degrees or even 3 degrees of warming. That's the difference between losing a further 500 million hectares of forest if we don't follow sustainable pathways, or actually seeing a return if we do follow 1.5 degree compatible pathways, seeing a return of around 350 million hectares of forest. So the entire restoration target of the Bond Challenge, effectively. So we hear a lot about what trees and forests do for climate, everything that they do to store carbon, everything that they do to help support our mitigation and adaptation strategies. But forests are really facing incredibly serious physical threats that increase in severity and impact with every rise in greenhouse gas emissions. But I think that the really devastating thing is that those physical threats have the capacity to undermine our best efforts, actually, to protect and restore them. So we looked, like I say, at these 3 kind of threat systems, rights-based issues, financial and trade-based issues, and then the physical threats. But I just wanted to kind of remind us that our forests and trees are under massive pressure as greenhouse gases rise. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. So actually, I'll pose the next question to Roslyn, because Maggie, the question I have for you is a follow-up, which is about the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership. We actually saw a host of announcements last weekend about national action plans, and Ghana is the co-chair of the FCLP. So Roslyn, the question for you is, what do you see as the FCLP's role in addressing global forest threats, particularly in light of the new science coming out telling us that we are not in a good place?
Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody here, and thank you for inviting Ghana and also the FCLP to be here. So I don't think this will be the first time that we've heard that we are not on track. We have heard this a couple of times. There was the 2020 TFA target. We didn't achieve that. We moved to 2030. And then came in the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. What the FCLP seeks to do is to have a vehicle that gets us to 2030 with the achievement of targets. So we don't want to get to 2030 and say, here we are again, let's shift to 2040 or to 2050, which is likely going to happen because most of the times we have these declarations made, pledges, but there are no functional vehicles. There are no functional mechanisms put in place to provide the support, to provide the resources to achieve these targets. Already a lot of forest countries are suffering because, I saw illegalities mentioned here. The real challenge of what we go through is battling illegalities and what we can give as an alternative. Because no matter how we see illegalities, they are a form of livelihood for some people. They are not sustainable. Nobody is promoting that. But the real question is someone wakes up in the morning and they are thinking about what to eat. And you need to understand that according to the chain of who the actors are in the illegalities. We are not talking about the funders. We are talking about the youth who are unemployed, who can easily be used for illegal logging activities, illegal mining activities. We are talking about local communities who, in one way or the other, are facing challenges with agricultural productivity. Yields have decreased. We are talking about farmers who are not attracting the right price for their produce. So it's a mixture of things that goes on in the landscape. And so the FCLP came together. Now we are 32 countries to understand what it would take really to get us to 2030 with targets achieved. And there are 6 action areas that the FCLP is currently working on. At COP28, as you rightly mentioned, there have been some initiatives and some announcements also put out there. One, we are looking at integrated country packages that are system-wide packages, that are holistic packages, that bring in a blend of funding or finance from different sources, philanthropy, private sector, sovereign nations, to address systemic issues, because addressing deforestation and forest degradation is systemic. There are different stakeholders in the forest landscape. When you talk about drivers of deforestation, these are other sectoral mandates. We could go on and on about agriculture, but there's a whole Ministry of Agriculture as well, just as there's a ministry that is, has oversight over forestry. You can talk about local government. There's a whole ministry also on that. Question is, how do you bring these people together? How do we address, and I saw trade again also mentioned, trade in deforestation-free commodities, like cocoa, like soy, like timber. And so the FCLP also has a conversation around promoting trade of deforestation-free commodities, also looking at how we can engage indigenous people and local communities very well. This morning, we were at the Peru Pavilion, and my fellow panelist was there to launch a platform for IPLCs to enhance engagement, not just to leave them at the tail end as being beneficiaries only, but to really start the conceptualization, development, and also the implementation of programs and projects with them, and to understand what it really means to keep forests standing and what we must do to incentivize the value of standing forests. Ghana, as a co-chair, and also as a country within the space, has seen value in just 1 year. Not just because we have announced the country package, but because the FCLP has given us linkages to partnerships that ordinarily we wouldn't have had. We have had the platform to engage countries that are also looking forward to address such issues. We have been in touch with private sector entities that ordinarily we wouldn't have had access to, or would have had difficulty in accessing, because there are linkages, because there are networks in there that we can leverage on. And so we believe that achieving the 2030 targets is very much possible. However, we need to ramp up action. We need to reduce bureaucracies. And one thing that we hope the FCLP can do is that to reduce the bureaucracy of having to get access to finance, get access to technical assistance. We also believe that we should all be able to appreciate the progress we have made so far, particularly from forest countrysides. I am coming from a country that has been part of the RED process for 15 years. If anybody is coming to transact with Ghana to provide support, I think those 15 years must count. You shouldn't expect that we start from scratch again. That means we are starting that whole cycle. The value of 15 years must adequately be compensated and recognized to make improvements. And so for us, we see that there is hope, but that hope depends on the determination for collective action that is not just about lip service, it's not just on paper, but is actually implementable and deployed at a scale that would work for the targets we seek to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. You covered a lot of very important points there. And so, Maggie, I have a question for you building off of that. I mean, the FCLP really came out of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use in Glasgow at COP26. So from the UK government's perspective, where do you see the biggest potential of the country packages that Rosalind was talking about? What is the innovative way of funding and the country packages potential in relation to addressing the issues facing forests?
Thank you. And I would start where... Is that on?
Yeah.
It is.
Yes.
I would start where Rosalind left off, and that's that this is about collective action. We know that there has been no pathway to economic development in the past that hasn't involved basically chopping down your natural resources or digging them up. And just as with the energy transition, we can't look to our partners in the global south and say, well, you know what, we did it one way, we'd kind of like you to do it another way, but whatever. And just as with the energy transition, there's a support packages coming through, things like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. For a land use transition, countries need to work together to build on the best practices that are there, to recognise the fact that forest countries have borne the opportunity costs of choosing different, more sustainable pathways, and to work together on that. Country packages are an attempt to bring together behind a set of systemic shifts with an investment plan that goes alongside them, to bring together both the traditional spending partners, the country donors, with potentially new ones, but also to unblock some of the barriers to finance. And I guess one of the really important things around them is that they need to add to business as usual. Because as Rosalind has so eloquently put, if what you're getting is a repackaging of what was already there, then all we've done is add to the bureaucracy and add a layer of paperwork and a round of self-congratulatory comments. But what we haven't done is help those countries to make that shift. Secondly, I think they can mobilise additional finance by crowding in support from unusual partners. That could be either groups who wouldn't normally work in the forest space, or things like banking sector, where investments in the land use sector are still seen as high risk, even though we know that there's an increasing portfolio of lower risk investments. But governments and banks working together can de-risk some of that less normal finance. And I think when we're working to deliver all of this, that challenge from Rosalind about how do we do this in a way that doesn't involve a whole new set of steps? This needs to be country-led. This is something where, congratulations to Rosalind, because she and Ghana have launched the Resilient Ghana package. And that's the vision from Ghana. And rather than us as the donor community coming in and saying, well, we've got this whole list of asks, we'd kind of like you to do this because we think this is how you will save your forests. This is about saying, we're working together, we know you know how to do this. Where is it that you need our help, and how can we make sure we crowd that in behind you? Whether it's the host country and perhaps looking at the way that the agricultural support is used and whether that could be done differently, whether it's donor governments and making sure that our support really does target the things that can make the biggest difference, whether it's multilateral development banks. And we are seeing real interest in this idea of country packages from players like the World Bank, where they see this as an opportunity to make a comprehensive contribution across a set of systemic shifts rather than a series of individual interventions which don't add up to more than the sum of their parts. But also the private sector and philanthropies and helping to make sure they play their part, whether it's through a different sort of investment or through something like the carbon markets. And it's through bringing together all of those diverse forms of finance into something which is comprehensive, that sits behind a plan for a systemic shift that means we think we can really make the change.
Thank you, Maggie. So I'm going to stay on the topic of the FCLP country packages with my next question for Sarah. I did just want to go back and say, if you joined us late or if you're joining us right now, we do have interpretation available. If you would like a headset, they're available on the desk to my left here. So Sarah, the question for you is, given the critical role of Indigenous people and local communities, how do you think the FCLP country packages can, one, ensure that Indigenous people's role as rights holders are better ensured, And secondly, the direct funding mechanisms which are being discussed be a part of those packages.
Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por la oportunidad, por el espacio que también nos invita desde nuestra experiencia y sobre todo el rol de las mujeres que estamos luchando para que mayormente sea visible en los procesos de diálogos. ¿Alguien va a interpretar? Ah, ya está interpretando. Perdón. Cuando la pregunta que se nos hace primero es mantener que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales desde siempre hemos estado protegiendo los recursos naturales, nuestros bosques, los conocimientos tradicionales han sido parte de esa resistencia y aporte sobre todo a los efectos que se enfrentan hoy el planeta en cuanto a la crisis del cambio climático. Pero también sabemos que venimos de diversas actividades de incidencia política, de cómo los pueblos indígenas tenemos que estar vinculados a todo este proceso. No pueden haber diálogos, negociaciones sin nuestra participación, porque somos los mejores conservadores, protectores de los bosques, y la ciencia así lo ha demostrado. Y como tal, es importantísimo que se pueda garantizar la participación plena y efectiva de los pueblos indígenas en todo el contexto. Ahora bien, se hablan de los paquetes, países, y es aquí donde tenemos la mayor preocupación en cuanto al tema de la implementación a nivel interno de nuestros países. No estamos buscando cómo monetizar nuestros recursos. No queremos eso. Queremos el acceso al financiamiento para seguir protegiendo esos ecosistemas, la biodiversidad, porque existe una presión inmensa de persecución, de la tala ilegal de los bosques, la falta de garantía a la tenencia de la tierra, a que se respeten los procesos a la consulta, el consentimiento libre, previo, informado de los pueblos indígenas y el acceso a financiamiento que deben llegar directamente hacia los territorios, a las comunidades donde están precisamente contribuyendo a cómo mantener el equilibrio de nuestra madre tierra. También que es importante que los conocimientos tradicionales de nuestros pueblos indígenas sean reconocidos como soluciones de buenas prácticas. Debe existir mayor voluntad política para que eficazmente se puedan cumplir los acuerdos que se debaten en diversas conferencias. Si no hay mayor participación, si no hay mayor responsabilidad, no vamos a lograr justamente el Acuerdo de París, la Agenda de Desarrollo Sostenible. Sin la participación de los pueblos indígenas, esto va a ser muy difícil y va a ser mayormente crítico también para poder salvar a nuestra madre tierra, el planeta del cual todos dependemos. Y por eso estamos aquí las mujeres, los pueblos indígenas comprometidos y enviándole nuestros mensajes para que seamos escuchados y que la voz de los pueblos indígenas sea aún mayor visible y en las negociaciones estar en la primera línea también de acciones, no cuando ya todo está realizado. Tenemos que estar desde el principio hasta el final y es una responsabilidad mutua. Ya nosotros hemos dado mucho, mucho hemos aportado, pero también necesitamos que nos acompañen. Los invito a que puedan seguir acompañando estas iniciativas para poder salvar nuestro planeta, pero salvar es justamente garantizar derechos.
Thank you, Sarah. I really liked your messages and especially your point about the need for Indigenous people to be on the front lines of the action. And I'm going to follow up on that, but I'd like to circle back to where we started about talking about the state of forests and the science. So we've heard quite a lot about what's happening with the FCLP country packages. So, Julian, back to you, and I'd invite all the panelists here to reflect on points you've heard. But the bigger question that I have for you is, in the Forest Declaration assessment, what are some of the pockets of progress that stood out to you, and what enabled them?
Yeah, thanks. Well, just reflecting on what we've heard from the panelists, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. And there are so many examples in the assessment reports and in the research that we do of really amazing initiatives happening on the ground, of wonderful efforts, projects that we think can be replicated and scaled. We've done a bunch of case studies of these. They are some of them very much in line of the examples we've heard about, some very different, but it's so encouraging to hear about what's actually happening on the ground and the efforts underway. So lest we're too negative when we focus just on the numbers. I mean, so to answer your question about kind of bright spots or progress, I mean, I said before, globally we're not on track to meet the 2030 targets, but that's not true of every country. Actually, well over 50 countries are on track to meet their national targets for 2030 to eliminate deforestation, which is fantastic. When we look at the regional level, particularly tropical Asia is very close to being on track to meet that 2030 target, and that's thanks in large part due to sustained reductions from Malaysia and Indonesia in past years. And I think that's owing to strong policy, working in a complementary way and in coordination with initiatives by the private sector in commodity supply chains to address deforestation in those countries. So, certainly a lot of really excellent examples to look at and to think about how we replicate in other regions and countries. Another bright spot, I think, is the passage of the EUDR. I mean, this certainly represents a ramping up of, or an expectation of, new corporate disclosure and due diligence requirements, and signaling a really important shift from voluntary to mandatory action. And I mean, also, a lot of the attention on the EUDR has focused on the impact on tropical forest producer countries, but it's really important to note that this is also, I think, the first time a demand-side measure has applied to logging in the global north. So, some really important developments here around in the regulatory space. Some other areas of progress, we see an increase in forest regrowth in tropical deforested areas, evidence that restoration is scaling up globally. I mean, the caveat there is that the data on restoration is not strong. This is something that I've actually worked a lot on over the last few years, is how do we increase the quality, the comprehensiveness, and the uniformity of data so that we can actually compare it globally. And this is across all the indicators, but restoration is a good example. We do face a lot of data gaps, and so I guess another bright spot is also just this increasing call for transparency and accountability on the goals, particularly these 2030 goals. I think with comparison to previous commitment platforms, we really see a lot of energy now around the GLD to see how we are going to get to 2030 in concrete ways. And so maybe I'll just take a moment to mention that this week we launched a GLD dashboard, Glasgow Leaders Declaration dashboard, together with the Systems Change Lab. You can find it on our website. It's dashboard.forestdeclaration.org. And we are providing a lot of this quantitative data that I've been referencing today in interactive charts. You can play around with the data, look at the historic trends, look at the pathways to 2030 and how we're doing on progress. And we see this as both an important sort of receptacle of useful information for governments to track and report on progress, as well as for civil society to push for accountability.
Thanks, Julian. Mary, I have the same question for you, because the Forest Pathways report really looked extensively at the pathways that are needed. So can you summarize for us what is needed to move the needle?
Yeah, thanks so much, Huma. I'm just going to jump back to this. I apologize for this rather complicated slide, but bear with me. We tried to ambitiously put those threat systems that I talked about at the start together with what we saw to be those groupings of where we really needed to see systemic pivot points. And we talked about, mobilizing finance. It's really important to keep drilling home the fact that both the FDA's and the Pathways report's best estimate was at least 100 times more finance going into activities that have the potential to harm forests than forest-positive finance, and that is such an enormous gap. So there's an enormous need for financial mobilization for forest-positive activities, and particularly pivoting and transforming those harmful subsidies. And some of the policies that Gillian just referred to, the EUDR legislation, fall under that third category that we talk about of transforming and shifting those global trade and finance systems. But I think we really saw as being the first step, lying above those three pathways to better, is the desperate need for the acceleration and realization of rights to those who we know steward forests best, to Indigenous peoples and to local communities. And this is a rights issue, but I think it is worth talking about some of the actual evidence as well. One study in 2022 looked at Indigenous territories pantropically and found that degradation and deforestation are lower across the tropics in those secured territories. So not to diminish the vitally important rights issue, but there is a huge amount of evidence for who stewards forests best. So I'm just going to circle back on some of the issues that my colleagues have talked about here. I think it's just really nice to take a moment to say how much we welcome the country packages, national action plans under the FCLP, partly because they contribute to closing that enormous financial gap, but they are host country led. Which is really, really important. And we're really hoping that those lead countries, as well as reporting on FCLP and taking the opportunity, will also take the opportunity to look at opportunities for reporting on the broader GLD goals as well. Yes, but I guess I'll stop positively there and go progressively negative in my other examples. I think it was disappointing to see an update on the traders' roadmap yesterday that fell short of the action needed to achieve that 1.5 degree future that we so desperately need. And whilst there were positive elements in that announcement, I think one of the things that was most alarming to see were future cutoff dates. We know that when we have future cutoff dates, it can really incentivize rampant conversion and deforestation, and that was disappointing to see. So as always, there are good elements, there are more disappointing elements, and I think it's important, given that the global stocktake is what a lot of people are here for and what the COP is reflecting on. And whilst it's positive to see nature mentioned for the first time, the lack of positive action on nature-based solutions, specifically mentioned in the global stocktake, it feels, when you reflect on that and when you reflect on hearing about all the incredible positive action across forested nations, it feels slightly like it's betting against that positive action to not have nature-based solutions included in the global stocktake yet. So, yeah, I think some way to go, but those glimmers of positive hope and genuine support for forested nations is definitely a really nice moment, actually.
Thank you, Mary. So you talked a little bit about country packages, so I'll go back to you, Rosalind. If you can give us a glimpse into the country package and the elements of the one that is being led by Ghana, and also just an example of public and private finance that can support Ghana to meet the goals of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration.
Thank you. So Ghana's country package is based on the experience of what has worked so far in country over the years. So we are really building on what, for example, our Red Plus strategy contains, our forest plantation strategy contains, our forest sector development policy contains. We are not starting from scratch. We have tested these different strategies out within different landscapes. They have already started producing emission reductions for results-based payments, and we believe that we have the capacity to scale these in country with the right technical and financial support. So the Resilient Ghana package, as we call it, is looking at industrialization of our key commodity supply chains, cocoa, oil palm. We haven't added share comprehensively for now, but also has the potential. So share for shea butter also being produced in Ghana in very large-scale quantities. Ghana is the fifth largest exporter of shea butter. We are also looking at providing green jobs for our youth who are largely unemployed, because there is a temptation for them to be used, and I use the word used advisedly, for a lot of the illegal activities that are perpetuated within our forest landscapes. There are so many unemployed graduates, there are so many young people within our communities who do not really have jobs to do, and also because we have supply chains that are transporting raw materials. So I think about 80 to 90% of our cocoa beans are exported as raw beans. What do we do by adding value? If we add value in country, we are creating jobs for a mass of these people who do not have jobs. And the third aspect is looking at translating all these into emission reductions. Ultimately, the 1.5 discussion is about emission reductions. Once we have these emission reductions, can we enter into the carbon markets, whether voluntary or compliance? We've done a great job with this through the Carbon Fund. Here at COP28 as well, we have signed an emission reductions purchase agreement with the LEAF coalition that the UK is part of, yes. And we believe that this would incentivize the flow of finance into our landscapes. So that is really what Ghana's package looks at. And we are looking at a blend of instruments. So we had one of our partners pledge about $500 million in concessional loans. I mean, when that happens, that would be amazing. And this is a very trustworthy partner, so we believe that is going to happen. We've had the government of the UAE also commit about $30 million to support restoration protection activities. We've had the government of Canada commit resources towards strengthening governance, which is very important as we talk about engaging all stakeholders and how we're able to promote inclusive multi-stakeholder participation. We have the USA also contributing to support forest monitoring systems, also very, very important. But to go forward for Ghana, we believe that to make all these work, and also reflecting on the points that I have heard, is one, the need to remove bureaucracies. I've mentioned this already. The bureaucracies we have in access and finance are just too much. If we need to speed the journey towards achieving the 2030 targets, we need to reduce bureaucracies. Bureaucracies that prevent, for example, indigenous people and local communities from engaging. I don't think that, I even wonder how many of our local communities will have like 10 days in a month to just be in meetings, participate in calls. These are farmers. They need to be on the ground. But the level of bureaucracy we have for engagement, for ticking boxes, or for achieving donor requirements sometimes are too enormous. The documentation sometimes are too heavy for people to distill. We need to eliminate that. We need capacity building. And capacity building for countries and for companies. I keep saying this. We talk about the private sector and the voluntary carbon market and the fact that it can generate the needed finance. But a lot of the corporates or a lot of the companies do not understand forest countries. And we don't blame them. This is not their core business. But if it's not your core business, it doesn't mean that you critique basically everything that the forest countries want to do. We need to remove that and build the right capacity. Until we get to that point, it will be difficult. And also build capacity for forest countries to be able to deliver the high integrity credits that we are talking about. We need to introduce inclusive regulations. We have heard about different deforestation due diligence regulations coming up. To be very fair and honest, both consumers and producers have contributed to where we find ourselves. It doesn't really help for just the consumer side to say, I have regulations on deforestation, and so you must abide by this. This is a cutoff date, and it's really for the companies. Question is, the companies within a supply chain are operating within countries. The companies can easily shift business. If they shift their business and the countries have not been supported, we are just going to see more deforestation, more degradation happening. So before we come out with regulation, the question we should be asking is, what do we want the regulation to achieve? It is to achieve 1.5, not just to say that the consumer side has regulation to prevent certain commodities from coming into their countries. The last one I would want to mention is the speed of delivery of finance. We have heard so many pledges here at COP28. It will be fantastic that by COP29, we are able to report that about half of these pledges have materialized, or half of these commitments have materialized. And again, it's about removing bureaucracies to facilitate the speed of finance delivery. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. So, Maggie, a dual question for you. It would be great if you can reflect on some of the points that Rosalind raised, particularly about challenges around regulation and the bureaucracy. And also, you know, how the second question is, how does the UK government aim to meet the forest goals as a consumer and also an importer of products that may be associated with deforestation?
Thank you. And I was first just going to pick up, I used to work in domestic agriculture in the UK, and this point around needing capacity building within companies, nowhere is that starker than in the finance sector. And I remember having conversations with banks in the UK around, and basically they will loan to farmers in the UK because land is really valuable. So they don't really understand the business model, they don't really understand agriculture at all. But they do understand that the land is valuable, so they will lend them money. So they will basically lend them money because there's an asset there, not because they understand the business. And so there's no incentive to have a smart business model because the loans will come irrespective. And it's just one tiny part of the puzzle. And the land use sector in general has all of these barriers, one after another, and that's in a country where, you know, we have a pretty sophisticated banking sector, or we like to think we do in the UK. But I'm also very struck by just how different our economies are. I think agriculture is something like 0.7% of GDP in the UK. So it's a lot of the land, it's most of the land, but it's a tiny proportion of the GDP. And most of the kind of big exports from the UK are services or the big high-tech stuff, aerospace type. And so we import almost an awful lot of everything else. And so our footprint is quite heavily overseas, whether that's in terms of deforestation footprint or water footprint or emissions footprint. We buy stuff in from overseas. And that is something that British consumers really are beginning to care about. And we're seeing a big proliferation in things like labelling schemes and quite confusing explanations of how green something is or how carbon neutral something is, or the impact, you know, a proliferation of standards that give you some comfort as a consumer. But I think the role of the sort of due diligence legislation, which Rosalind has just picked up on, to some extent is providing comfort to the whole of the consumer market that anything you buy meets a certain baseline standard. And the route the UK has chosen to take on that is to say, well, we know that 80% of the problem, 80% of deforestation is illegal in the country of origin. So our legislative approach is to say, well, if it was produced illegally, it shouldn't be imported into the UK. And Rosalind is quite right that the burden of proof sits with companies, but then again also down the chain with countries, particularly in countries where the monitoring and traceability systems have been centralised and are owned and run by government or government agencies. And so there are, in implementing this legislation, there will need to be a partnership approach, and it has to be something that's seen as working together, producer and consumer countries. And we, you know, but it's part and parcel of a wider set of of approaches, one of which, the Forest Agricultural Commodities Trade Dialogue, is very much about how do you make space for governments from the global north and the global south, those that have big productions, those that have big imports, and bearing in mind that there's really no such thing as a producer country or a consumer country, because Ghana will be producing timber and cocoa and shea butter for its own domestic markets and for its own region, as well as for export into other countries. So the differentiation is sometimes a bit clumsy, but fact gives a space in which we come together as governments. And weirdly, you'd think we do that all the time on everything. We don't. UNFCCC is a pretty extreme example in that it's treaty bound, but this kind of cooperation that allows space for different countries to come together and just share how things work is one of the ways we're trying to improve how we deal with the kind of regulations and make sure that the voices of the forest countries who are most impacted will be heard. But we also do a whole bunch of other stuff to try in an attempt to be responsible consumers to a degree. And we had a cross-sector task force, which some people may remember, called the Global Resource Initiative, which WWF also helped to lead, but worked with some of the big business sectors within the UK and helping us to identify where the biggest impacts would be in terms of things that government could add to the picture. And we introduced on the back of that a package of measures, of which due diligence is one part. Another was around national commodity footprint monitoring platforms, so that we know where the big impacts for what we buy come from, which are the countries, which are the products, where do we need to concentrate our efforts in order to lessen our footprint. Reviewing our public procurement standards. So when you look at what schools and hospitals and prisons and the other parts of kind of government purchase, that's a massive bulk buying power. So if you can set standards for those, that really drives markets. Even in a country as relatively small as the UK, it sends a very strong signal to businesses based in the UK and selling more widely. We're also working closely with the finance sector. So on things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, working on the basis that if you ask companies to disclose, to share what they're doing and what their impacts are, that kind of provides space for our civil society partners to kick up more of a stink about which companies are really not doing what they ought to. It also provides the basis potentially for future regulation, and companies know that, so they tend to start falling into line even ahead of any regulatory measures. Finally, as a donor government, we've supported interventions on both the supply and demand side, both through support for emerging sustainable business models through things like partnerships for forests, but also through demand-side measures like the Tropical Forests Alliance and the Amsterdam Declaration Partnership, which provide spaces and evidence around the demand-side pull. We've just announced £500 million extra to continue efforts in this area over the next 10 years. And I think finally just a kind of couple of remarks, picking up particularly on Sarah's intervention. I think as a set of donor countries, we haven't done well enough in terms of working out how we bring Indigenous and traditional voices to the table and how we then recognise, if you take the logic chain that says areas of forest ecosystems that have Indigenous and traditional communities within them tend to be better protected anywhere else, there should then be a logical chain that says, so supporting those Indigenous and traditional communities in whatever it is they need, whether it's access to healthcare or access to education or access to internet, whatever it is that allows those communities to thrive, if you take the logic that they are delivering environmental services on behalf of a wider population, we should be able to channel finance directly with much fewer prescriptions on the back of it. And that, I think, is something where we just haven't got it right yet. I think we are trying to do more, but I think that's an area where over the next few years we really need to just be better, both at making that direct case, which you explained so well, but also about responding to that and about making the systems which are set up for a bureaucratic set of global northern countries. And Rosalind is quite right about that, because even I don't understand the gobbledygook that comes out of our lawyers and pages and pages and pages of emissions reductions agreement that, anyway, it's a bit of a personal bugbear between the two of us. So I think that kind of those challenges about how we make it. And then finally, one piece on that, which is that I think it's really encouraging from this COP, is beginning to see discussions about innovative finance mechanisms that would recognise the value of standing forests. So the UK is a strong supporter of carbon markets, high integrity carbon markets that recognise rights and respect them. But what carbon markets are not good at currently is recognising carbon stocks. So the big sinks of carbon that exist within our natural ecosystems, they're good at reflecting changes or flows. And I think that's something else. Brazil has just announced a big innovative finance, and we're beginning to see kind of ideas emerging in the climate nature space. And I really hope we can all work together to pursue some of those and to find light touch ways of really making them work.
Thank you, Maggie. I'd like to pick up on your point about Indigenous people in local communities and segue to Sarah. It would be great to get your reflections on that point. The Global Alliance of Territorial Communities has been doing a lot of work to bring together many different Indigenous groups in different regions and countries. So can you talk a little bit about what is the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, and how can it help to leverage Indigenous people's interests with the aim to halt deforestation by 2030 and meet our global goals?
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta. La Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales es una alianza que representa a 24 países, a 5 regiones importantes donde se encuentran los últimos bosques del planeta. En ella pues está conformada la región de donde yo vengo, de Mesoamérica, a través de la Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosque. Tenemos pues a la organización APIBI del Brasil, a AMAN de Indonesia, a Repaleaf de la cuenca pues del Congo. Y estos miembros justamente protegemos más de 900 millones de bosque a nivel del mundo. Y la estrategia que nos une, o los principios que nos une como pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales en defensa de nuestra madre tierra, era lo que hace un momento le comentaba, el acceso a el acceso a la tenencia de las tierras de los pueblos indígenas, a que existan el respeto al consentimiento libre, previo, informado de los pueblos indígenas, el acceso a financiamiento y en este principio hemos lanzado una plataforma para el financiamiento denominado Chandia, que cuenta con principios, mecanismos de cómo deben trabajar con los pueblos indígenas, porque nos consideramos socios en todo el proceso. Y aquí es como decir, uno de los elementos más importantes que se puede vincular y que puedan aportar todas las necesidades que conlleva en la misma. También el tema del reconocimiento como soluciones de buenas prácticas son los elementos importantes de que nuestros conocimientos siguen siendo ese elemento fundamental para proteger y buscar el equilibrio con nuestra madre tierra. Lo que buscamos también es la participación y la visibilidad de las mujeres en todo el contexto. Necesitamos pues seguir vinculando esas estrategias necesarias, pero de manera en conjunto. Y eso es la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales, de mantener los principios básicos de nuestros pueblos indígenas, de que existan las garantías y respeto hacia nuestros derechos.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think we have time for one quick question from the audience, if there is
Hola, buenas tardes. Yo soy Karina. Esta pregunta es para Sara, porque sabemos con muchas comunidades no tenemos acceso a ONGs o a cuentas bancarias como para acceder esta finanza que usted dice que quiere acceder. Entonces, me gustaría saber para usted cuál es la propuesta de cómo acceder a estos fondos, sabiendo que muchas comunidades por todo el mundo no tenemos estas formas de recibir fondos.
Sí, es una pregunta muy interesante. Dentro de la plataforma Chandia es como decir, la plataforma que complementa la visión general de la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales. Cada región ha construido su propio mecanismo de cómo accesar a los fondos o cómo también deben aportar hacia estos fondos. Por ejemplo, en Mesoamérica tenemos al Fondo Territorial Mesoamericano, que ya está en función, que ya está buscando, como decir, está aportando a esas iniciativas que se necesitan desarrollar dentro de sus regiones. De igual manera, AMAN, APIBI, Repaliaf. Entonces, en este caso, no hemos estado preparando justamente para responder a estas necesidades y por eso los invito a que conozcan más de Chandia, a que conozcan más de las regiones que conforman la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales, porque ahí está la esencia de cómo brindar todos esos apoyos que se necesitan, pero con principios y sobre todo con el respeto a que se garanticen los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're right at our closing time. I would like to thank all our panelists, Jillian, Mary, Maggie, Roslyn, Sarah. We've heard a lot here today, a lot to digest. I think the big takeaways for me are we are not on track. We need to close the finance gap, but it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot we can learn from, and there's good progress that we're seeing in some spaces. For example, in the regulatory space, though there are hurdles that need to be addressed. The FCLP country packages that we heard about provide a framework for country-led solutions and for innovative financial mechanisms. And I think we'll hear more from FCLP tomorrow. There is also the important role of indigenous peoples, and we need to learn from their traditional knowledge, respect their rights, and ensure that they are included in all these discussions, because they're really at the front lines of actions. So I guess my main takeaway is we have the knowledge, we have the science, we know what the pathways are. We need to go beyond lip service, as Rosalind said, and move to real action. So with that, thank you again for participating, and thank you to all our panelists. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions afterwards. Thank you so much for attending.